Hey everybody, it is Dr. Z. Here we are with Absolutism and Constitutionalism. We're going to go over the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, Absolutism, Louis XIV, and Peter the Great. So it starts with a defenestration. This is the second defenestration of Prague. Fenestration comes from the word window, like in Italian, it's finestra. So they're throwing somebody out the window. All right, so this is the second one. It starts the 30 Years' War in 1618. Our friends at the Czech Center Museum in Houston, Texas say that the conflict arose between Protestants, Bohemians, not hippies. Okay, we use that word today. But it's Bohemians, okay? They are from Bohemia. It's an area in today's Czech Republic. And Catholics, who are Habsburgs, over the building of Protestant churches. The disagreement resulted in the defenestration of 3 Catholics who were involved in the decision to ban the building of Protestant churches. This was the response to restricting religious freedoms that have been in the country since the Letter of Majesty signed by Emperor Rudolph II in 1609. So the first defenestration happened in the early 1400s. You remember Jan Hus, who's sort of like an early Protestant reformer. Those who cite Protestants threw 7 members of the city council in Prague out the window to show their discontent with the Holy Roman Empire. So the second defenestration starts the 30 Years' War, where Protestant Czechs are rejecting the Habsburg Ferdinand II as the King of Bohemia. They want a Protestant ruler, who's Frederick V. Their first battle sounds very epic. It's the Battle of White Mountain, and it settles this. The Catholics win, and Ferdinand then makes all the Protestants give back Catholic lands, and everybody has to be Catholic. Enter then Christian IV. He's the Protestant king of Denmark, and he wants to protect his Protestant fellows in Prague, and so he enters the war to protect them and reduce Catholic expansion. He doesn't want Catholics and the Holy Roman Empire to come up into Denmark. So all of this sort of gets ended in this first phase by what's called the Edict of Restitution. Okay, this is where Catholic lands are given back to the Catholics, and non-Catholics are told to emigrate. Then there's a couple other phases of the war, and it becomes about a lot more than religion. It becomes about stopping the growth of the Holy Roman Empire. The whole war itself, after the 3 phases, is ended by what's called the Peace of Westphalia. So in the last part of the war, French Catholics are on the same side. They're fighting on the same side as Swedish and the Swedish Protestants and other Protestants. So it's not about religion anymore. It becomes about stopping the spread of the Holy Roman Empire, respecting state borders. Plus the devastation was really bad. It was a really violent and brutal war. But this was, you should know, is the last religious war in Europe. So your key concept outline wants you to know that the Peace of Westphalia marked the effective end of the medieval idea of universal Christendom, which means Catholicism for everybody. And it accelerated the decline of the Holy Roman Empire by granting princes, bishops, and other local leaders control over religion. The Peace of Augsburg, okay, you remember that, right? We learned about that in the Protestant Reformation, then becomes permanent, right? And it adds Calvinism and to Lutheranism and as other legal Protestantisms, okay? So we learned about the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Westphalia is sort of like that on steroids, right? It's princes, bishops, other local leaders, everyone in the whole area, right, now can choose your religion, right? So you're going to have this wonky looking map of who's Protestant, who's Catholic in the Holy Roman Empire. Likewise, the Netherlands at the end of this war seeks sovereignty from Spain. Okay, so they're not part of the Spanish Habsburgs anymore. And then your key concept outline wants you to say that following the Peace of Westphalia, religion declined in importance as a cause of warfare among European states. The concept of the balance of power played an important role in structuring diplomatic and military objectives. All that is to say is really that the Peace of Westphalia has a lot to do with starting Europe down the path towards nations rather than kingdoms. However, in this time period, there's this whole concept called absolutism. So your book says kings in absolute states asserted that because they were chosen by God, they were responsible to God alone. They claimed exclusive or absolute power to make and enforce laws, denying any other institution the authority to check their power. your key concept outline wants you to know that absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in government, but preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges. So the big sort of question is, what really is absolutism, and is it the same as a dictatorship? A lot of it has to do, though, with absolutism is with this concept called the divine right of kings. So the definition of that is that God had established kings as his rulers on earth, and they were answerable ultimately to him alone. So kings could not just do as they pleased. They had to obey God's laws and rule for the good of the people. And the whole idea is sort of like the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, right? That if the king is, they have to be good, right? Otherwise they're not following, this divine right. The other side of this also is that the kings are seen at the top of the great chain of being, right? It's not the Pope, it's the kings, because God has chosen the soul to go into the child who's going to be born as the next king, right? That's sort of the biological, if you will, sort of way to explain divine right. Here we have an etching from the British Museum. You see Charles I, British king, kneeling, holding a crown of thorns, okay, like Jesus. There's a ray extending from his left eye to the crown of martyrdom at the top right. So like, God is kind of coming to him, and the Holy Spirit is coming into him. Another ray from the back of his head extends to the clouds at the top left. And in the background on the left, a rock in the middle of a stormy sea. Okay, get a metaphor there. And in the foreground, a landscape with a palm hung with the weights of justice, right? So, it's this whole idea that like the kings, maybe you're kind of like St. Peter, the rock, right? There's this whole idea of like, they are the state. And actually, Louis XIV, the Sun King he's called the Sun King. He's famous for saying, I am the state. L'estat c'est moi, right? So like I am France, more or less. Your key concept outline wants you to know that Louis XIV's nearly continuous wars, pursuing both dynastic and state interests, provoked a coalition of European powers to oppose him. Big surprise there. So he refused to delegate power to a first minister, right? So he was an absolute ruler. Like there's no prime minister. But he did have other ministers in his court doing various tasks. They were chosen from very capable people from more modest origins. So the people who were working directly for him were not nobles. He took a personal role in the decisions of several of the councils of state that ruled over the realm. Read, he was a micromanager. He never called an estate's general meeting so that the nobility could not unite against him. He wanted everyone to be Catholic. He repressed the Protestants. He did not like the Edict of Nantes, okay? And this Edict of Fontainebleau, as you've heard about before, right? Basically, all of the Huguenots now are not welcome. They're not tolerated anymore in France. So this Sun King lived in a palace called Versailles, which, he was instrumental in building. And from Britannica, it says, as the center of the French court, Versailles was one of the grandest theaters of European absolutism. If you ever get a chance to visit there, you will see it really is an homage to Louis XIV. There is this sun figure almost everywhere, all over the palace. This is the Hall of Mirrors, which is going to come up a number of times. Fun fact, this is where the declaration to make Germany a state gets signed. Here we have Bernini's sculpture of Louis XIV in the Baroque style, and this gives you kind of a sense of the grandeur of Versailles as a palace itself. So one of his ministers was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Your key concept outline says that Louis XIV and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, extended the administrative, financial, military, and religious control of the central state over the French population. And so we have learned about Colbert when we first started talking about mercantilism, right? So the idea then is that Colbert did all of these things, and you can take notes on them, right, to help Louis XIV like grow the wealth of the state of France with mercantilist methods. The another sort of big figure in absolutism is Peter the Great. So your key concept outline wants you to know that he westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions. And of course, Catherine the Great continues this process. So Russia itself was a multi-ethnic empire. The Russian middle class did not grow like Western European ones, and they were bound to their towns and jobs. Peasants were called serfs, and they were bound to the land. Wealth came from Siberian furs and mining. And in 1649, serfdom was extended to all peasants. So that really restricted any of their rights. Lords had complete unrestricted rights over them. There were penalties for harboring castaways. They required everyone to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. That's the Orthodox Christianity, right? And then in the wake of all of this, Peter the Great comes into power. So he built Russia's first navy. He toured Western European capitals. He brought experts back to Russia. He was very envious of the British navy and wanted to kind of build up the Russian navy. He forced all nobles to serve in the army, right? He said, look, you have to gain some skills, folks. He created schools for navigation, math, medicine. So he's really big into science and math. He created an interlocking military and civilian bureaucracy, and everyone starts at the bottom and works their way up. Peasants were taxed, and serfs were arbitrarily assigned work in factories and mines, right? So was he a good guy? Was he not? It's hard to say. But in his next war, he won, and he brought Estonia and Latvia under Russian rule for the first time. This made Russia a dominant power in the Baltic region, giving them more land on the Baltic Sea, and made them a great European power. He also established St. Petersburg as a capital. So every summer, 40,000 serfs were brought there to build the city. Nobles were ordered to build expensive palaces and live there. And he required merchants and artisans to settle there. So he required nobles to shave their beards, wear Western clothing. He wanted them to attend parties where men and women would mix together and freely choose their own spouses, which was not the way of the day at that time. He also imposed a law of inheritance by land by one son alone. So daughters and other sons could not inherit. This was called unigeniture. And here's a map of what sort of the vision of St. Petersburg was at the time. Okay, so we are going to stop here. I'll see you in part 2.